Okay, hello everybody. Thank you so much for joining us and welcome back to Emory Climate Talks. My name is Eri Saikawa and I'm an Associate Professor of Environmental Sciences at Emory University. So October is a lot of things. I learned that this week is a National Diversity Week. October 12th, coming Monday, is Indigenous Peoples Day. And October is also a Hispanic Heritage Month and a Global Diversity Awareness Month. I think what we're going to talk about today, well, what we're going to hear from Professor Auer today, environmental aesthetics, has a lot to do with diversity and culture as well. And I'm so very excited about that. Emory Climate Talks is made possible by an anonymous donor that supports our trip to the United Nations climate change negotiations. And Emory Climate Talks is run in partnership with the Department of Environmental Sciences and Resilience and Sustainability Collaboratory at Emory University. Before I introduce our speaker today, I wanted to talk about some logistics and thank you all for coming. And thank Leah Thomas for doing all the work behind the scenes. As usual, this talk is being recorded and we have muted you all. Please use the chat function to address any questions you have to the speaker at any point. We will take them at the end after the talk is over. All the past talks are on a YouTube channel and you can subscribe at the link that I will provide in the chat message later. Please also subscribe to our newsletter so that you will receive all the upcoming talk information directly by email. 2 weeks from today, on October 23rd, we will have Ms. Jasmine Crow, the founder and CEO of Good Art Inc., to discuss fostering change and creating awareness about poverty, food waste, and hunger. On November 6th, we will have Professor Sanya Carley from O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs from Indiana University, Bloomington. And she will talk about socioeconomic disparities and energy insecurity among low-income households, predating and during the COVID-19 pandemic. Please visit our website that I will also put in the chat box later to find out more about the upcoming talk information. So today, I'm so excited to introduce Professor Matthew Auer, Dean of the School of Public and International Affairs and Arch Professor of Public and International Affairs at the University of Georgia. His research focuses on the politics of decision-making in the arenas of environmental protection, energy policy, and forest policy. And as you will see in a bit, he is such a brilliant teacher. Professor Auer studied biological anthropology at Harvard, where he graduated magna cum laude. He went on to earn a Master of Arts in Law and Diplomacy from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and earned a PhD in Forestry and Environmental Studies from Yale University. He joined the Indiana University faculty right after that, and Professor Auer was my mentor there when I studied for my master's degree at Bloomington. Professor Auer was so patient and kind enough to show me the path to a PhD. I came to the US from Japan without knowing absolutely anything about academia, and I was so lucky enough to meet amazing people like Professor Auer so that I could pursue a PhD. This is very embarrassing, but I had not even heard of Princeton University. But thanks to Professor Auer, I ended up applying for it at the last minute as he agreed to write recommendation letters. I actually still remember he was so kind to tell everybody that I would be a tiger, and I had no idea what that meant other than thinking there must be something between Princeton and tigers. So sorry, it's too much about me, but I'm just amazed at how Professor Auer cared so much about a foreigner that did not know anything and really helped me out all the way. So it is no surprise that Professor Auer has received so many teaching awards, like the President's Award for Teaching Excellence. And again, I'm telling you that he's an amazing teacher. He was Dean of Hudson Honors College, where he created honors level program and rich study abroad experiences for students. Professor Auer was the one that would give me advice also on my research, even when I had left Indiana. When I struggled so much to find research questions, he showed me papers that were so helpful, and I really cannot thank him enough for his mentorship. But in light of the Global Diversity Awareness Month, I also want to say one more thing. A couple of years later, after I left Bloomington, my mentor from Japan asked me if I had any professor that I would recommend inviting to Japan to speak. Without any hesitation, I recommended Professor Auer. My mentor soon invited him and thanked me profusely for the great suggestion. It's always nice to be thanked when you just introduce a great person, but I was so impressed when my mentor told me that Professor Auer has such a deep knowledge of Japan. I knew that Professor Auer had served in a variety of public policy roles at national and international levels. He was, for example, a senior advisor to the US Forest Service from 2001 to 2006. And during that time, he was a member of the US delegation to the United Nations Forum on Forests and to the International Tropical Timber Council. But still, I had no idea that he would know so much about Japan. So this is what's amazing about Professor Auer. He is so well-versed that you can ask him anything that you will learn so much. For example, his recent research considers social media as a space for influencing users' perspectives of environmental risks. And so I'm sure you can ask him about that too, in addition to environmental aesthetics and everything else you might want to learn today. So as you can see, I can literally go on forever giving praises about Professor Auer, but I will just stop here. I just want to thank you so much, Matt, for being such a great mentor and for graciously agreeing to talk about your work today. So the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Saikawa. I'm deeply humbled by your remarks, and I would simply say to fellow students and everyone who knows you that if you pressure test your very kind comments, people know that you're a force of nature, and with or without our collaborations and our connection to one another and our networks, you would be exactly where you are now, which is doing fantastic things at Emory. And I'm so honored to be part of the climate talks and sharing some thoughts about this field of environmental aesthetics and what it has to say about climate change. And I know this is probably a little bit different from other talks that you've had, which probably deal more with scientific tests of knowledge. And this is really coming from a different epistemology, if you will. It's really coming from the philosophical arena of knowledge and ethics. And so it's probably a little different, but I would propose to you that it's worth thinking about, because as the types of things that you're looking at in your climate talks presumably deal with, okay, well, let's forecast what the future will look like. Let's think about what's happening now. How do we know that these phenomena are real? What's the scientific basis of that? How does that help us project into the future? And really, philosophy is trying to do some of the same things, but it's using a different set of tools. And to me, it's no less important than using things like hypothesis testing and experiments to try to understand the future. Because at the broadest level, humankind is going forward into this natural experiment, and the human condition is partly driven by, and it's partly shaped by, the experiences that we will have with nature. And our quality of life will be a function not only of our things like access to food and shelter, and whether there'll be sufficient amounts of water and these key existential things, but there are other existential things to think about, including, well, what's our relationship to nature? To what extent will we be able to detect beauty in nature and have positive aesthetic experiences? Those things are important. They're part of quality of life. And so it's important to think about these issues. And philosophy has an angle on this, and it's worth looking at what the philosophers have to say to help us think about the future in a climate changed world. So that's really the impetus for these thoughts. So maybe we could start with some basic principles with the field to make sense of some first principles or basic elements of philosophy to give us a grounding or a foundation. So, efforts to try to understand the essential question of what is beautiful what is an aesthetic? What are the qualities of the aesthetic? Go back thousands of years, certainly as far back as the ancients, who, among other things, are trying to find essential, inherent, unchanging forms of beauty that could explain why one has an aesthetic experience. And so Plato and Aristotle and others, the Greek ancients, are grappling with that question. There's something of a breakthrough that carries through in an indelible way to current philosophical debates on aesthetics that begins with Kant. Because Kant introduces this notion that our aesthetic experience is separate from our personal and our particular religious, economic, social, and relational understandings of the world. So how we've been brought up in our homes, the relationships that we have with friends and their opinions, and to the extent that influences us, class, race, experience, bias, those things are from this thing known as the aesthetic. Aesthetic association is disassociated from those other determinants of an experience. They're isolated from those things, and we have this quality of disinterestedness and impartiality in how we engage with nature, with things that are beautiful. Well, that basic thesis has generated thousands or perhaps millions of pages of debate in the philosophical, in the literature on aesthetics. And it is the cornerstone of the field of environmental aesthetics. Environmental aesthetics, as a field of study, really focusing on the environment per se as an entity or an object, in more recent times is an offshoot of the aesthetics of art appreciation, and in particular 19th century art and British landscape painting. And British landscape painting and sort of understanding, well, why do we think that that landscape is beautiful? What are the determinants of that? Why is this experience evincing notions of beauty, and how do we define that? Is richly described then in this 19th century literature, and that also, of course, has a transatlantic quality and influences the Hudson School of Art and art appreciation. And from that, there's a kind of derivative set of explorations into, okay, now we're out of the museum and we're into the environment. We're now studying nature and wildness. And in what ways can we capture a notion of the aesthetics, of the aesthetic from our observations of nature? Much of the early explorations are really derived from the vocabulary of looking at paintings and art, whether two-dimensional or three-dimensional art. Now, John Muir is interesting because he jumps onto the scene and says, that's really limiting. When I'm in the Sierras, when I am in the midst of nature and this wildness, there's more happening to inform my aesthetic experience than simply this separation of me and that object that I'm observing in a museum. And moreover, the things that people describe as ugly, I actually find them to be beautiful. Snakes, spiders. The things that frighten people actually have a positive aesthetic for me. All of nature is beautiful, John Muir says. Well, this sort of shakes up the field and makes people think differently about nature? Is it possible for us to talk about an aesthetic experience that's removed from the confines and the strictures of really talking about the aesthetics of art? So there are many debates, more than we can begin to tackle here, because we do want to get into the issue of climate change. But among the ones that really bear on the subject of climate change and resonate would be, among other things, the proposition from Alan Carlson that pleasurable experiences with nature are actually a function of what you know about nature. So this is interesting for scientists in the audience. If anything, he's proposing your scientific knowledge actually gives you something of an advantage in appreciating the environment, because you know something about scientific principles. And so this scientific cognition enriches and enables you to appreciate the environment in ways that someone who is not conscious of science and of scientific principles would miss. There's a reaction to that in the form of non-cognitive approaches. The idea being, well, it isn't simply a rational appreciation of nature that enables me to appreciate nature. There are other pathways of appreciation that may be emotional and have nothing to do with reason. There are multisensory pathways. As I am engaging or communing with nature, that moment of a breeze blowing by, or different moments over the course of an afternoon where the sun has different angles and shadows take different forms, and a whole set of multisensory experiences are happening. Those are part of environmental aesthetics as well, and they have nothing to do with scientific cognition. So there's a debate there. Another debate has to do with defining beauty and defining ugliness. So there is a school within this field that would propose that there is no ugliness. Ugliness is actually just a form of beauty. It's just we don't fully understand. We have to do a better job of defining ugliness to realize that actually it's a form of beauty. All of nature is beautiful. Now, this probably harkens back to a Protestant Enlightenment era notion of nature as God's creation. By definition, it has to be beautiful. Emily Brady, I think, does a terrific job of really pressure testing that and proposes, no, wait a minute. There is something called ugliness, and it's not beauty. You can isolate, and again, she's relying on that Kantian disinterestedness and say, no, wait a minute, we need to isolate what ugliness is and make sense of that. And it isn't sufficient to say, well, what is otherwise ugly is part of this broader ecological story. So when I'm looking at a decomposing carcass of an animal, and I try to explain away the ugliness of that because it's actually part of a broader cycle of life, you're punting on the issue, the key issue of, well, wait a second, why is that carcass beautiful? All you've done is explained it away by saying it's part of this broader ecological story. You haven't explained in aesthetic terms why that carcass is beautiful. And you need to do that in order to make the case that that otherwise really ugly thing is genuinely beautiful. She doubts that. She thinks, nope, there really is ugliness. It's a negative aesthetic. It's not a part of some positive aesthetic. So that's quite an interesting debate that's in this literature as well. Okay, then there is this question of whether aesthetics can actually be isolated from moral and ethical considerations. And that really ends up being the heart of the paper that I've penned. I am actually contesting something that Brady is proposing and spends a lot of time on in some of her writing. And again, she, I think, at the end of the day, is a Kantian and is hanging on to that notion of disinterestedness, as many philosophers do. I will readily admit, and by bearing the lead here, I'm not sure that I'm contesting that there is this isolated, separable thing called aesthetics, but I'm asking a question about, does it really matter if aesthetic experiences become extremely rare going forward in a climate changed or a climate ravaged world? Who cares about positive aesthetic experiences if those things become extremely rare or become very conditional? So I'm not really contesting this thesis about the impregnability or immutability of this thing called an aesthetic. But I am contesting a sort of more practical or probabilistic question about aesthetics in light of climate change. So let me move forward with her argument. The basic argument she's making is that they are separate from moral considerations. Brady proposes that aesthetic experience is a relational kind of experience where you and the environmental phenomena are in space and time, and you're having an experience with that object or that system, let's say an ecosystem, and the forms and functions of that ecosystem, the shapes, the shadows, the textures, the colors, are all part and parcel of that aesthetic experience. However, you can strip away moral considerations, other biases that you might have that might shape that experience, and isolate this thing called the aesthetic experience. That's very Kantian. I'm not sure I'm courageous enough to really test her on that. I will take as a prima facie argument, okay, let's assume that's the case. In any case, her approach is an autonomous approach. The aesthetic experience is autonomous and removed from, among other things, moral considerations. All right. She has a paper dealing with climate change, so it's spot on to the questions that we're grappling with today. And she provides an abstract example to try to tease out these moral considerations and make the case that they are really separate from the aesthetic experience. Assume that there are two different divers who are visiting a coral reef. Diver number one is an inexperienced diver and is visiting a coral reef that's damaged. So let's assume it's a bleached, climate damaged reef. That individual is taking in the physical and other dimensions of what she is viewing and experiencing. The colors, the shapes, the forms, the shadows, the fish or other animals that are visiting the reef. And those are part of her aesthetic experience. Her experience is going to be different from diver number two, who's a more experienced diver. Diver number two actually has knowledge of what a healthier coral reef should look like. Brady makes the argument that regardless of that, and regardless of the fact that diver number two can distinguish and differentiate between the damaged reef and the healthier reefs that she has visited in the past, the aesthetic experience is basically unaffected by those moral or experiential considerations from the past. Instead, it's the moment she's having. The aesthetic experience is in that moment. She is also viewing that reef, taking in the aesthetics of the reef, And this is separable from any sort of moral or ethical assessment she's making about that reef vis-a-vis other reefs that she has visited. So there's a general argument that comes out of this, and that is the negative human impacts that we have on the environment don't change the fundamental experience of aesthetic appreciation. Sure, you might reflect on, well, this is a damaged reef, or it's sad that coral reefs are increasingly in this imperiled condition because of climate change. But those things are separate from the aesthetic appreciation of the reef that you're viewing. Very Kantian. Now, she makes a really interesting argument, which is, imagine it is the case, imagine it is so that moralism and moral calculus and the weight of moral issues and ethics do weigh into the aesthetic experience. If that were the case, if you take that argument to its extreme limits, we would be unable to appreciate environmental aesthetics. We would not have any positive environmental experiences aesthetically, because we would always feel racked with guilt about the anthropogenic impacts that we have on the environment. So she, as she writes, imagine a place where no one can bear to enjoy nature's beauty because of human impacts on the environment. I call this in the paper a kind of finger-wagging moralism. So imagine you're two divers and they're experiencing they're having this aesthetic experience with the reef. Whether they are enjoying or having any positive aesthetic experience in that moment, it's going to be ruined by this third diver who shows up and says, oh, isn't this terrible? Because of people, you can't enjoy this reef. Forget about the pretty fish that you still are viewing in and around this damaged reef. You shouldn't be enjoying that. We should be racked with guilt. We should feel terrible about it. This is finger-wagging moralism, I would describe. She says, isn't that absurd? I think she's probably right. That would be absurd. Wouldn't it be awful to, even in the midst of climate change, to have the impossibility of enjoying nature because we're continually thinking about the damaged environment and our impact on the environment and the folly of humankind? I think she might be right about that. So moralism, there's something to that. But let me go a bit further. I think in the extreme, yes, there's an argument to be made here. Now, let me quickly move to an argument that's built into this autonomous perspective, which is coming out of another area of aesthetics called the aesthetics of the everyday. Very interesting corner of the philosophical literature on aesthetics, which I think in partly is a reaction to the 19th century approach, which is, wow, you have to have a big, huge landscape painting of a glorious sunset in order to appreciate art and to appreciate the environment. You have to be at Yosemite in order to appreciate nature. And in fact, what the everyday aesthetics crowd is saying is, no, that's not the case. As one philosopher puts it, the everyday aesthetics is the difference between space and place. Space is unfamiliar, is unappealing, and hence has very little aesthetically pleasing about it. When you put familiar objects into a space, that turns it into a place. Then it has warmth. Then it has aesthetic value. So your bedroom might not be a grand painting or piece of art, but it's a familiar place and it has its own aesthetic qualities for you. this would be indicative or emblematic of the aesthetics of the everyday. The arguments or the principles that we pull into the conversation on climate change takes the following form, probably best articulated by a very talented philosopher named Ariane Nemikos, who argues that going forward with climate change, as the climate changes, we will continue to have positive aesthetic experiences because we're going to adapt. And as we adapt, we develop new routines, and those routines become familiar, and our climate changed environment takes on a familiar form, and pleasurable aesthetic experiences become part and parcel of that more familiar space as we adapt. Moreover, those new routines, the new habits, the changes that we have to make because of climate change, those things in and of themselves become familiar patterns and are part of our daily life and our routines and are part of everyday aesthetics. They will actually compensate, as she puts it, they will create aesthetic comfort that offsets otherwise negative experiences that we have in the midst of climate change. Interesting argument. Okay, in the paper that I've written, I think it's online, I think it's free. And Ari, we can share the link if people are interested. I basically make an argument that takes three forms. Climate change and misery, the fickle fortune of climate change aesthetics, and positive environmental aesthetics as a kind of backwards looking nostalgia are challenges to some of the things that we've just described with autonomism, with everyday aesthetics of climate change, et cetera. Let's unpack those. So with Nemikos's argument that we adapt to climate change, I find it presumptuous. She makes the point that we need to make sure that we're in control. If you're in an uncontrolled environment where things are just happening to you, where bad things are happening to you, like I don't have the ability to adapt to climate change, then by definition, you will just have negative aesthetic experience. But so long as you can control those experiences, then you'll develop these new routines and you'll have positive aesthetic experience. I can test that. And what I do in the paper is bring in a couple of cases to pressure test that, including cases from Nepal and cases from Malawi. So the Nepalese case would be in alpine regions where, because of decreased snowfall and drought, we find people changing their routines, and in particular women, because women are the natural resource managers at the household level. They must change their daily habits in order to take care of their families, and they can control that situation. But it's very clear that they're not having aesthetic comfort in the form of these new routines compensating for that uglier environment that they're now living in. Those new routines are tiresome, they're loathsome, and they're dangerous as well. And they are disproportionately beset upon particular people. So women, poor people, people of color are more likely to actually be victims and have to be on the short end of climate change for all the reasons that I bet you're learning about in this series of lectures. I would argue it's also the case when it comes to aesthetics. The Malawian case from Kokoda speaks to the same situation in a sub-Saharan African context, also having to do with scarcity of water and the inequitable ways that this redounds on women versus men. So sure, there are new routines, but there are far fewer moments for a positive aesthetic experience, and it's all taking place amidst environmental conditions that are, strictly speaking, uglier. So I am making the argument that the new routines do not create a compensation for diminished positive environmental aesthetic experiences. Among other things, they're just fewer positive environmental aesthetic experiences, opportunities for that. And moreover, the new routines are drudgery and they're dangerous and they are disproportionately affecting particular people, particular populations. Okay, the second issue that I raise in the paper is what I call the fickle fortune of climate change aesthetics. The hypothetical case then would be two homeowners. Homeowner A is living with an unobstructed view of a coastline and of the sea from their coastal home. And homeowner B, who's a neighbor, doesn't have an unobstructed view because, among other things, homeowner A's home is in the way. So you can import this to the Georgia context and imagine two people with homes on Sea Island or St. Simons or something like that. Imagine the most beautiful local vista, and both of these people are pretty well off because they have homes on Sea Island, but homeowner B has an obstructive view. Now, climate change happens. Imagine Hurricane Delta, which is now affecting Louisiana as we speak, destroys the home of homeowner A. Now, homeowner B has an unobstructed view of the ocean. The aesthetics are improved. The Brady argument is that, well, the aesthetics are unaffected by moral considerations. Homeowner A takes in the new aesthetic positive assets that are afforded by this unobstructed view of the sea. Again, I have to ask the so what function, and I have to ask whether it really, how easy is it for us to separate out these ethical considerations when it's clear that homeowner B's new aesthetic advantages are at the expense of homeowner A, who has lost her home. It becomes increasingly difficult to talk about aesthetics as this sort of disinterested form of experience when the proximity to these outcomes are creating winners and losers in the midst of climate change. And the winners' wins are so clearly at the expense of the losers' losses. It's very different to think about the moral considerations in Brady's diver case than the case that I just presented to you. In the diver case, as I propose here, the divers, to the extent that they're thinking about the moral issues, particularly, let's say, diver number 2, who knows the difference between a healthy reef and a less healthy reef, still there's this sort of diffuse feeling of guilt. There's this sort of abstract notion of, well, isn't it sad that these reefs have taken the forms that they have because of human folly. And to the extent that I'm responsible for that, well, it's because I'm part of the species, and the errors that we've made with climate change and with fossil fuels and with greenhouse gas emissions and so forth, well, that's led to this coral reef situation. That is a decidedly more diffuse form of moral weight on the aesthetics than is the case of the homeowners. Homeowner B's proximity to the sequence of events that have led to the advantages that they are experiencing, and their proximity to what's happened to homeowner A and the demise of homeowner A's environmental experience, aesthetic experience, it's much more palpable, much more tangible, much more obvious. I would propose to you that in a climate changed world, you're going to have more experiences in the form of the homeowners than you will of the abstract divers, the divers with their more remote kind of connection to what they are observing. And that raises really important philosophical and ethical questions that are not being addressed by this autonomist approach. Okay, finally, I would propose then that in a climate change world, and particularly if we have the status quo ante and we go forward into a world where we're not really trying to mitigate climate change, but we're just adapting to inevitable climate change, you're going to get more ugliness. And beauty and positive environmental experiences, aesthetic experiences, are going to become more rare. They're going to become more novel. And that's going to change the way we think about nature. And it's probably going to lead to a kind of romanticization of nature as we have more of a backward-looking view of what beauty is. Well, nature used to be beautiful, but now it's harder to find that beauty because of climate change. And so to the extent that we talk about environmental aesthetics, it tends to sort of be in the past tense. It tends to take on a more of a symbolic quality. So if you will, just for a moment, think about if you took a person, take a child, a 12-year-old child, and who knows nothing about the difference between an osprey and a bald eagle. And you were to ask the child aesthetically, and you probably, what you mean by aesthetics, what is it that you enjoy in observing the osprey and observing the bald eagle in terms of their behavior? What's beautiful about those two birds? You're likely to get some fairly predictable, I think, responses to those questions, and probably the difference between the osprey and the bald eagle, to the uninitiated who doesn't know anything about the difference between those two birds, they're going to find commonalities in what's beautiful in those birds. Well, of course, the bald eagle in the American psyche has this enormous weight of symbolic import, which is almost impossible to disentangle from the aesthetic experience of thinking about the bald eagle. And part of it is this kind of backwards looking aesthetic, and it's thinking about the narrative of the bald eagle, the demise, the DDT, the affecting the life cycle, the bird becomes an endangered species, the Endangered Species Act, Rachel Carson, and the rebound of the bald eagle, the beauty of the bald eagle as an American political symbol. It's impossible to disentangle those things from our experience of the bald eagle versus the osprey, even though in some ways they have very similar kinds of ethologies, animal behavior. If you look at the way they take care of their young, the kinds of food that they're going after in terms of foraging, etc., the reproductive cycle. So what's my point? Well, my point is, over time, in a climate ravaged world, we're going to have more bald eagles. And to the extent that we think about nature and we think about beauty and aesthetics, it's going to have those things that we value and from which we derive aesthetic pleasure are probably going to be adulterated by stories, by heroic tales, by a set of values, by a set of narratives that are romantic, that are symbol laden. And so it becomes increasingly difficult to take this very narrow view on what aesthetics means in a climate ravaged world. And basically positive environmental aesthetic experiences become one and the same with nostalgia. There are other interesting implications about this, including the prospects that things that we've previously thought of as ugly are recast in a new light to make them beautiful. That's effectively what John Muir was doing. Say, wait a second, let me explain to you why snakes are beautiful. We might be doing that in ways we can't even imagine now with things that are otherwise decidedly ugly. Because we're going to become accustomed to ugliness, and we will develop a refined sense of that aesthetic experience and find beauty in that ugliness in ways that we might not have, because there's going to be so much that's ugly. All kinds of interesting things flow then from this climate ravaged world in terms of differentiating and understanding our aesthetic experience. Okay, so in conclusion, I would propose to you that climate change is putting pressure on this autonomous understanding of aesthetics, this notion of aesthetics as being separate and distinct from things like moral considerations. Secondly, this notion that we will adapt to changing environmental conditions and climate change, and that will be a source of aesthetic compensation, I would dispute that straight on, head on, and say it's at best half right, because we're going to adapt as best we can, but there's going to be a lot of aesthetic loss. And even it's might be so problematic that it's preemptive. We don't even have time for aesthetic contemplation. And to the extent that we do, it's complicated because there's not that much out there that is aesthetically pleasing in the traditional sense. And that takes us really to the third part, which is this notion of diminished aesthetic opportunity. And we can already see, and we could do survey research, there's some empirical propositions here where we could actually get at people's direct aesthetic experience and pressure test this notion of whether, well, you're adapting now to the, let's say, more to the fact that there's less precipitation, growing seasons are changing, how you commune with nature is different because of climate change. How are the changes that you're experiencing redounding on your aesthetic experience? Lots of interesting possible empirical tests here that are not simply philosophical, but actually get into the into other fields of knowledge that would be interesting to us, whether sociology, anthropology, political science, public policy, etc. So that in a nutshell are the things I'm grappling with in this paper. The pieces I mentioned to you, in particular by Brady, Carlson, Nomikos, are worth reading. Emily Brady is such a whiz. I love everything she writes. Her piece on ugliness in nature is so interesting. And to come back to what Ari is talking, I mentioned at the beginning with respect to thinking about diverse perspectives on aesthetics. Wow. If it really is the case that there is this separate space where aesthetics lives that can be differentiated and isolated from the diverse perspectives and lived experiences that people have, and can be removed from bias, there needs to be so much more research on this. And I'm fearful for the autonomist position on this. I think it just becomes increasingly difficult to defend, and it becomes, if you will, the autonomous perspective becomes basically something of philosophical interest instead of a kind of practical aesthetics, a kind of aesthetics of the everyday that we try to maximize for normative reasons. I wouldn't want to have that grounded in this autonomous perspective because it's frankly not very serviceable to those ends that I just mentioned. Maximize an aesthetic experience, or understand diverse perspectives, or understand aesthetics as taking diverse forms and inclusive forms. I don't get very far with the autonomous perspective because, again, the moral considerations, the other sorts of things that Kant is basically dismissing do affect that aesthetic experience at the end of the day. I think the moral considerations do affect the aesthetic experience. So with that, I'd love to hear any thoughts on anything I've provoked here.
Great, thank you so much. I would love to give a hand of applause by everybody here. And we already have like 16 questions, so I would like to get to them. The first question from Alyssa, for the bleached and dying reefs, I have heard that you can actually smell the decaying reefs. Would that change the experience for the inexperienced diver?
Yeah. So, this really question reminds me again of this ugliness quandary in environmental aesthetics and the philosophy of aesthetics. There is, again, this school of thought, which is that, well, every aesthetic experience is really about beauty. And to the extent that the odor of decay is visceral and immediate and negative, well, the problem there is that you simply are lacking in this holistic notion of the cycle of life and the decomposition of the coral reef. Yes, it's this unhealthy reef, and the smell and the unsightly features of it are inseparable from the human pressures that have led to it. But the aesthetics are by definition positive because there's only beauty in nature. And what we're observing there with this decaying coral reef is comparable to the healthy reef when it eventually dies and decomposes. It probably also has a detectable smell. What we're seeing is just the beauty of the cycle of life accelerated, albeit for artificial reasons. But so the example the sort of archetypal example that is used in this literature is the decaying carcass of the elf and the maggots that infest it. If you've ever seen maggots infesting a carcass of an animal, humans, and I have, maybe many of you have, particularly ecologists here, you can't help but be absolutely disgusted. And Brady talks about disgust and says, this disgust is really a big test to her saying that there is only beauty. And you simply need to understand the full narrative to understand that that's a beautiful thing. She's proposing that's not the case because you are trying to explain away through this holistic environmental story why it is that it's valuable to have this decomposing coral reef, why that's part of this broader story about the science of life and death in nature. She's saying you're punting. You're punting on the key question of what it is aesthetically that's beautiful about the odor of that decaying and dying reef. I think she's basically right about that.
Great. Next question from Sophia. How do you view the relationship between environmental aesthetics and conservation? Just like what you said, some people believe that there exists beauty and ugliness in nature. And sometimes beautiful things will be protected more, but some people argue that only the things people do not like or do not see, the use can be preserved.
Yeah. So, the philosopher Berliant and Sato addressed this issue. And it ends up being very important in this broader area of environmental studies in thinking about the difference between preservation and conservation. And the sort of simple version of the story is, well, the preservationists, the conservationists, like let's say Teddy Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot, they're interested in protecting forests because there's a utilitarian value to this forest because we can use them to burn wood for our fireplaces and build our homes and so forth. That's why you want to protect forests. Versus the sort of, and I'm simplifying the story, the preservationist view of an Aldo Leopold, which is no, or John Muir, which is no, we preserve nature because it has beauty unto itself and that should be appreciated. Well, even then, if you were to sit down with John Muir, he would tell you in his opinion about things that were worth preserving and things that are not worth preserving. And so it wasn't like Muir found beauty in everything. He found beauty in all forms of nature. That's where the everyday aesthetics crowd comes in and says, well, wait a second, there is aesthetic value in the built environment. There is aesthetic value in things that are not intentionally meant to be beautiful, including my bedroom. and the fact that I have some throw pillows on my bed. That creates an aesthetic that's familiar and beautiful, and I'm having a positive aesthetic care of that. And if I take the pillows off the bed, then I can speak to a kind of deprivation of aesthetic experience because I've done that act. The conservationists, I think, need to reflect on it, conservationists and preservationists. So when you hear students say, well, you know, the more ethically pure or the moral high ground is with the preservationists because they're saying that nature should be appreciated unto itself, you are forced to unpack that if you're really serious about environmental philosophy. Well, wait a second, what do you mean by that? Are all forms of nature, are all environmental phenomena, should they be preserved? Are mosquitoes beautiful? I mean, there are a whole set of things that then get tested against that proposition. So I guess the environmental aesthetics expert who's worth their weight in salt is very caught about the knee-jerk embrace of either a conservationist ethic or a preservationist ethic, or any kind of policy penchant that's protecting A instead of B. Those are political decisions. They have to do with a set of normative values. They may be driven by a set of instruments like cost-benefit analysis that, by the way, are normative and value-driven. But those are really different from the much deeper, basic first principles types of questions that an environmental philosopher would be contemplating as they unpack aesthetic experience.
So Georgia asks, what do you classify as nature, and how does this impact the thoughts on environmental aesthetics you've reviewed?
So it's conceivable, and this would be care of, let's say, the writings of Bill Cronin, who's an environmental historian. He's not really an ethicist per se. Cronin grapples with this question of nature, wilderness, and the environment, and basically ends up in a place with his book Changes in the Land with a thesis that I by and large agree with, and that is there really is no nature anymore. The Anthropocene is so all-encompassing that it's possible now to go to the far reaches of basically any body of water in the world, including the far reaches of the Barents Sea or the Arctic Ocean, and you can find microplastics everywhere. Now, if I have a handful of that nice water in my hand, I just scooped up that nice cold water that I have in my hand, the Arctic ice water that's melted there. Isn't it beautiful? Isn't it lovely? I might be deriving some aesthetic pleasure, but if I put it under a microscope, I find if I have a phase contrast or electron microscope, I'm going to see those microplastics. That's taking away from my aesthetics. Carlson would say, you know, the scientific cognitive means you have a lesser experience than the person who is not conscious of those things. Well, if I build out that thesis, then there really is no nature. And what Cronin is saying is that, you know, we haven't had nature for a long time. And so when we look at landscapes and we think back in a sort of nostalgic and romanticized way about the primeval forest of New England, let's say, this is the particular environmental substrate that he's thinking about in Changes in the Land, he would propose that, well, actually for thousands of years, those environmental conditions have not been pristine because there have been Native Americans, indigenous people, have been using the land for subsistence, and that's changed the land. By definition, if nature is this sort of pure, unadulterated notion of the environment that's pristine and primeval. Well, it's really hard to find that. And what he is saying, Cronin, is that from an environmental historical perspective, primeval nature has been pretty rare for a long time because people have been affecting the environment for a long time. So I basically buy that. In which case, I hope I haven't freaked people out, but I'm not sure that there really is nature if we're really thinking of it as an idealized type. It doesn't really exist.
Right. So Sydney asks, what about the time in between the changes brought on by climate change and adaptation in reference to moralism, tainting aestheticism? How would one view nature with the arguments you've mentioned in that limbo time, as adaptation will take time as all things do?
Yeah. So that's a great question. And if you're a Carlson type of person, then depending upon your knowledge of natural processes, your scientific cognitivism, and your understanding of these subtle changes that are happening to the environment as the environment is adapting. It's a very nice piece in, was it yesterday's, New York Times about the experience that foresters are having in, among other places, New England, I think in Massachusetts specifically, as particular climax type forests like sugar maple the trees are increasingly sick and dying. Well, they're being replaced by other kinds of trees, namely red oak, more hickory. From an aesthetic perspective, maybe there's no net loss. I like the sugar maples, but I also like shagbark hickory. It's cool to look at the bark. But from a scientific cognitive perspective, or from the skill base of an arborist, no, there's real negative aesthetic consequences because I understand what should be there, which by the way is very normative, right? And Cronin is saying, well, you're talking about what should be there from the perspective of somebody who understands nature at this moment in time and over the past few hundred years. But there was a time when that same ecosystem in Massachusetts that you are looking at now, that landscape of trees, some of which are dying because of climate change. Well, it was the case between roughly 1830 and around 1910, when that landscape that you're looking at was dominated by white pine, because all those trees had been cleared out during that first generation of the agrarian economy in New England. And what came up in those disturbed soils were basically almost like a monoculture of white pine. Now, those trees were subsequently cut down in the 10s, 20s, the Depression, to build homes for immigrants, et cetera. And what came up in the midst of that was the deciduous forest that's familiar to us throughout the Northeast. The arborist is thinking about that forest. Cronin is saying, you have to put yourself in place and time to really understand change, aesthetics. He doesn't really talk about aesthetics per se, but you can see how easy it is to shape these questions in a historical context, including the one that was just posed, which is how will we think about aesthetics? What will our experience be? Well, it sort of depends. It depends upon the knowledge that you have, your sensitivity to these things, these subtle changes, et cetera. Again, a person who doesn't think about, well, sugar maples don't do that well in a climate that really is a bit more like Georgia's climate, where we don't see a whole lot of sugar maple, by the way, but we're basically importing Georgia's climate now into places like Massachusetts, the Northeast. If I don't really know much about the forest, 50 years from now, 100 years from now, and I'm seeing mature hickory trees and mature oak trees, I might think they're very beautiful.
So Gina asks, how can the aesthetic experience be addressed when developing climate change policy? To what extent can aesthetics be disregarded, assuming people's aesthetics may adapt during this process?
One of the concerns I have with the we will adapt with climate change and our aesthetics will adapt with climate change argument is that, among other things, without any other consideration, if we just take that argument and agree with it on its face, because we will adapt to climate change at some level. We also know in the midst of climate change adaptation that some of us are going to be better off than others. We can already see that. We have more stagnant hot days in Atlanta than we did 10 years ago. There are some people amongst us who suffer from that now in 2020 because they can't afford air conditioning, made worse perhaps by the fact that a utility may have cut off your electricity because you're not paying your utilities because we're in the midst of a pandemic. I guess where I'm going with this is that the notion that our aesthetics will adapt as our climate adapts, and as we now don't have the sugar maple and now there's a hickory tree there and I'm adjusting to that, it becomes part of my familiar everyday. It's presumptuous. And worse, it's patronizing, because there will be any number of people who are on the losing end of that equation and who become ill, who suffer from the health consequences of a climate that they can't adapt to. Now, again, they may be able to control their everyday. You know, this is a hassle. You know, now I need to change my daily routines because I need to adapt to climate change. I keep the windows open at night and hope that it cools off to deal with the hot days. And that becomes part of my familiar world. And there's some aesthetic comfort that I get in raising the windows every day at 6 p.m. in the late summer to begin to take advantage. I find all of that to be presumptuous, and ultimately, as a generalization, it just doesn't work, because we end up with people who are on the losing end of that. And that population grows and becomes more diverse as the climate becomes less and less hospitable.
So McKinsey asks, aesthetic knowledge has been fundamental to the scientific understandings we have developed. In evaluating the power of positive and negative aesthetics, both as pathos and ethos, the appreciation of nature's beauty and the ethics of environmental degradation, how do you think this approach to climate change action will be hindered by scientism?
Well, I think part of the problem is as basic as even people who are of goodwill and well-meaning and care about climate change and who are promoting policies and interventions that can address climate change, including on the mitigation side and not just on the adaptation side, which by itself, climate change adaptation is ultimately a losing proposition. I think most people here would agree, because you're not really doing anything to reduce emissions, change our economy, transform it so that we're actually reducing the pressure on the environment. Even people who are of goodwill and who are thinking very broadly about drastic actions that we need to take today to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to think about the future that future generations will inherit. I would propose that they also need to think about environmental aesthetics as part of their problem nexus. So if you define the problem as being largely about the economy, largely about temperature change, largely about the hydrological cycle, these things that are absolutely vital and crucial to the way we think about, okay, what science do we need to know in order to be informed about policy interventions? But I think we also need to open our minds to some of these areas of knowledge and ways of understanding quality of life that haven't traditionally been part of science. And by the way, when the economists try to value some of these intangibles, as they would call them, and actually try to build them into their utility models, it tends to be pretty underwhelming. It's not to come up with a travel cost method or a willingness to pay model to capture all elements of environmental aesthetics. I think the environmental aesthetics, the information that I've unpacked for you shows that, wow, the economists have a way to go before they're doing a fulsome job of capturing the value of environmental experience, aesthetic experience, encounters with nature. So I guess at the bottom line would be, for scientists and for the 99% of people who actually 99% of scientists who think that climate change is a real phenomenon and that we need to do something about it, they need to build in considerations for environmental aesthetics, which, by the way, involve a different way of understanding the world that, by and large, hasn't really had much to do with science to really flesh out our understanding of environmental value.
So there are so many more questions, but considering the time, if I can ask 2 more questions, is that okay?
Sure.
Okay, so Tracy Yandel asks, could Aldo Leopold's famous quote about the last wolf in the mountain dying be another illustration of your nostalgia argument in a historical context? Specifically, the ugly and feared object reimagined as beautiful. So quote, when our right empty, the old wolf was down. We reached the old wolf in time to watch the fierce green fire dying in her eyes. I realized then, and have known ever since, that there was something new to me in those eyes, something known only to her and to the mountain, end quote. What might be a climate change parallel to the wolf, something we currently fear or dislike, but may one day soon have a new aesthetic appreciation for?
So Professor Yandel, once again, I think demonstrates that she was well-trained at Indiana University. That's great to hear from you, Professor. So one of the arguments that I'm trying to develop here, it probably requires an additional paper, is that climate aesthetics, I think, takes on some of the features of the aesthetics of the rare. Things that are rare tend to have an elevated kind of aesthetic value in our imaginations. Think about discovering a rare mushroom, a truffle, or ginseng. Ginseng root absolutely is beautiful if you know something about it. If you know about the qualities that it provides, the flavor of ginseng tea or the health attributes of it. Again, here we are back to scientific cognitivism. I would propose that as any number of objects and relationships in the environment, in habitats and ecosystems, become impaired, those things will be, the healthy ecosystem that we once knew becomes increasingly rare and will take on that much more of a heightened aesthetic value. With climate change, if we were to just sit down, the group of us here, we could probably map out an answer to Professor Yandel's question by thinking about those species or habitats that right now are at the so-called tipping point. So when we think about the Sahel in Africa and the prospects of moving from an extremely dry environment, but having Sahelian vegetation in it, to just basically one and the same with what's first the Sahara and the expansion of desertification. To the extent that you find beauty and aesthetics in rare things that are in the Sahel, those are among the first things that will be imperiled the aesthetics of those things will be imperiled in the context of climate change, probably earlier than any number of experiences that we might have in the forests of New England. Just because the forests of New England are probably better buffered to the ravages of climate change and these decades that we're going into now, those things that we find great aesthetic value in, those experiences that we have that are correlated with things that are most imperiled, those will be our wolves, the last wolf. And then there'll be this, you know, in the pessimist scenario, you can just build out the number of ecosystems, the number of aesthetic experiences that are at risk moving forward. Now, the Paris Climate Agreement posing to us in a sense that 2 degrees Celsius increase in temperature really takes us to that threshold where we really don't want to go past that. In fact, the Paris Agreement calls for ensuring that we are well below 2 degrees Celsius. Without getting into the aesthetics, you can use that as a proxy, a very back of the envelope approach to thinking about aesthetics that are at risk, the wolves that are at risk. Now, the Paris agreements and all the documents that inform that from the United Nations panel, there are 3 different working groups. They never talk about aesthetics. They talk a lot about endangered species. They probably should talk about aesthetics as well to really help us think about what's at stake here. Because I think they're probably missing some of the last wolves, even as they project ahead and inform our understanding of why we need to act now.
Okay, so moving on to the last question, Judith asks, some companies use the nice aspects of nature, such as polar bears, to advocate climate change policies and bring awareness about global warming. Do you think climate lobbyists should use relatively attractive or nice aspects of nature to make people relate to the effects of climate change, considering that people do not think climate change is an imminent issue because it is sometimes intangible?
Yeah, great question. So this reminds me a little bit of, not of a philosopher, but now we're getting in, my response would be in the policy space and another area that I'm interested in, which is communication and political communication. And Professor Saikawa talked about this years ago, maybe when you were a student, I can't remember, but do you remember Harold Laswell? We talked about something called the triple appeal principle. Laswell would say that if you're trying to persuade somebody about something and to make them change their behavior or to embrace a particular policy, then one model that you could use is to think about Sigmund Freud's notion of the 3 parts of personality: the id, the ego, and the superego. The id is that impulsive part of your personality. The ego is the rational, cognitive part that Carlson is talking about when he talks about scientific cognitivism. And then there's the superego, or the subconscious, which is the moral, reasoning part that's thinking about, that's sensitive to matters that would make you feel guilty or make you feel ashamed. What Laswell would say is that you, as the environmental advocate, need to think about your audience. What are you trying to persuade? Are you trying to persuade them that they should pay a few extra cents for a gas tax to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to discourage taking trips in their car for things that are not necessary, for example? How would you craft that campaign? What symbols would you use? What's the best way to reach your audience? Well, it depends. It depends upon that audience. I might be dealing with a very skeptical community that doesn't want to talk about climate change. It's stigmatized. You know, that's something that environmentalists focus on, and I don't believe it. It's leftist gobbledygook. I'm betting that I can appeal to you, however, if I frame that issue in another way that so that it's associated with something you care about, like your kids' health. Or if I can persuade you that you could actually come out better off and make money, that there's a profit motive to adopting an environmental approach. That's exactly what Kamala Harris did the other day in the VP debate. She was basically appealing to reason. If we think about Laszlo's concept, she appealed a little bit to impulse when she said, you know, this is an existential threat. That's also a little bit of an appeal to conscience. But what she said in terms of policy terms is Joe Biden's going to create jobs that are built around green jobs, green energy. We're actually going to create jobs. That's a rational argument. Oh, okay. Actually, if we deal with climate change and we try to mitigate greenhouse gases, it's actually going to be good for the economy because it's going to create jobs. Obama did the same thing. Obama, go back and look at his debates in 2008. He proposed the same thing that Kamala Harris did. So I guess where I'm going with this in a nutshell is, depending upon your audience, what you're trying to get across and how you appeal to people, particularly if you're trying to have them adopt your point of view, you could use the triple appeal principle. Now, keep in mind, there are very unethical ways to use the triple appeal principle. You could persuade people about all kinds of nasty, negative, horrible, prejudicial things by appealing to their impulses, appealing to their conscience, appealing to their reason, and in particular, appealing to their impulses.
Thank you so much. I wanted to, so I was just summarizing what we talked about. We talked about aesthetics, philosophy, ethics, policy, science, and communication. And I'm just so excited that you were able to merge everything in one talk and then have such an engaging discussion. I'm so sorry to everybody that we couldn't raise the questions that you had. There were just so many in the chat, but it was just so amazing. So thank you so much, Professor Auer, for taking the time. And thank you so much to everybody that had great questions. I hope you will join us again in 2 weeks. And until then, stay safe and healthy. So thank you again.
Thank you. What a pleasure.
Thank you so much.